data. We strive to make sure our observations and research are grounded in data instead of some tree you might hear in other parts of the industry. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, digital health is a huge space, so today I'm really just going to be drilling down into what's happening in the data side of healthcare, especially in the US. So we'll only be talking about things like regulation, insurance, changes in processes as they relate to data itself. To talk about this, I'm going to be talking about quite a few things. So we'll start about the activity that's happening in the private markets in digital health as a whole to get a sense on how the industry is doing and where the activity is happening. Then I'll move from there to talk about the beginning of the digital health movement, which started with EMRs and the digitization of data. And from there, I'll move into the new wave of data that's being generated outside of the hospital. We'll also talk about the entire area of research and clinical trials and how that's being disrupted by the new wave of digital health data. And then finally, we'll wrap up on talking about how the future of healthcare looks thanks to genetic sequencing and that data that's being created, how some tech giants are entering the space, and then we'll end it by asking some open-ended questions for the future. A good way to give some context about why this is important is to take a look at the private market trends. We use CB Insights data to track some of the trends in digital health, which we consider to be any software solution that's used to improve the efficiency or process within healthcare. As you can see here, there were a record number of deals and dollars invested last year, with more than $5.7 billion invested across 889 deals through the whole industry. So it's really just a trend going up and to the right. Looking more granularly at the stage level, we saw a ramping up of seed investment going to 2012 as excitement in the space increased. And since then, the deal share has stayed relatively the same, with early stage deals taking the majority of deal share. And unsurprisingly, California has seen by far the most activity. But interestingly, nearly every state has seen at least one deal into a digital health company since 2010, and 15 of them have seen more than 50 deals. The most active investors in the space come from pretty much every different side. So we're seeing accelerators like Y Combinator and Techstars, tech corporates like Qualcomm, healthcare corporates like Merck, and also general venture capital firms like Lux Capital and Norwest Venture Partners. So all this stuff is sort of just trying to set the stage for how hot digital health is right now. But let's get back to the issue of healthcare data. We're going to start by talking about some of the macro trends that are happening, and then we'll dive more specifically into each part and how healthcare data is changing there. One of the biggest shifts we're seeing is the empowered patient. Thanks to a shift to fee-for-value medicine and healthcare, which is putting outcomes and quality at the top of the priority list, patient care and experience have become a very central focus of the industry. And not only that, but new tools are letting patients generate their own data outside of hospital settings. But we still have a long way to go, especially since most patients don't know or can't access their own healthcare data. Precision medicine is a phrase that's definitely picking up speed in healthcare. That's thanks to things like individual level data from gene sequencing and tracking devices. Because of those sets of data, we can actually give a much more personalized, individual level of care now that we know more individual data about each patient. And by doing that, we can actually increase the population health objectives by focusing on each individual one at a time. Something I'm going to talk a little bit about is the lack of interoperability, and that means the ability for data to move freely across health systems. And that lack of data flow is largely thanks to a broken EMR system, an electronic medical record system, which profits from data moats and lacks the ability to process real-time data. But there's some promising news in the future thanks to new standards, which will hopefully allow us to understand more as we conduct analysis across a wide range of data types. And this new set of data is pretty much relevant to everyone. So we're seeing people from insurance, tech, pharmaceuticals, and we're all seeing a lot more partnerships happening between these players. But the issue is that because healthcare data is so personal, there are a lot of issues that go about who should be seeing the data and who should be owning the data. Okay, so let's start getting into some of the specifics of the different shifts that are happening. And to do that, we'll start with the EMR, EHR systems, and the digitization of health records. So a little backstory here. The High-Tech Act of 2009, which was part of the post-recession stimulus package, was basically designed to bring hospitals into the modern era of tech and gave hospitals and doctors a reason to start using electronic records instead of the paper ones that they were used to before. And an incentives and penalty system was created to encourage the meaningful use of EHRs, which has so far doled out more than $32 billion to get physicians and hospital systems set up on these electronic record systems. So before 2009, less than half of physicians were using electronic system, but today we're seeing something more along the lines of an 83% penetration rate, with some studies actually saying closer to 90% by the end of 2015. And the missions of EMRs was a good one. So ideally, we'd move away from paper records like the one you see here, which has some, legibility issues. That's a physical copy that can only be accessed physically. Plus, we can use things like alerts and reminder functions to basically just keep doctors aware of what's happening with their patients as a whole. Not only that, but we could actually, in theory, promote communication between doctors and their patients, but also between doctors themselves to improve coordinated care for patients that might have to see multiple specialists. And we could decrease the number of patient safety events, so things like medication errors or complications due to misinterpretation of information. Here in one of the analyses that I took a look at, which analyzed an EMR system, patient safety events not only reduced by 15 to 20% leading up to time zero, which was the time the EMR is adopted, but after it was adopted, we're seeing a downward sloping curve, which suggests that the EMR system is actually helping prevent further safety events. And finally, we can make sure that critical information like lab results, past exams, are not missing from patient records. So when doctors take a look at their patients, they'll have a full and really holistic view of what's happening with them. And that's what it should be like in theory. But if you talk to any doctor about their EMR system, I'm sure they'll have very different sentiments, and they'll probably have a few choice words about how they feel. And why is that? Well, it's because when the EMR rollout was designed, it was really just designed to make physicians start using the EMRs, but didn't really have incentives for interoperability, and therefore these software providers created data moats to keep customers from switching. And not only that, but a common complaint is that physicians now spend a lot more time looking at their computer instead of the patient. And if you've ever been to a new doctor recently, you can probably attest to that. The rollouts for these systems were very long and expensive, and that only increased the switching costs even more. And finally, the UIs are incredibly non-intuitive and unnecessarily complex. I don't know if any of you guys have ever seen the face of an EMR system, but it's definitely something left to be desired. A big part of the root cause of these problems is because after the legislation was passed and the incentives were given, a land grab occurred where basically a large portion of the users were concentrated in the top 3 software providers. So I think what's really interesting to note is that Epic, which not only has 11.6% of the total market share, but it's also the primary software provider to the larger practices, which means that the most number of individual physicians are interacting with it. But also, going back to the long, expensive rollouts we talked about before, these are the customers that are much more unlikely to remove this software regardless of the quality just because the switching costs were so high. And all that brings us to, what does that mean for the future of the EMR system? It can't stay like this forever. I think one thing that's important to note is that almost 80% of doctors are above the age of 40 and are very much used to the era of pen and paper. Now, when you combine that with the fact that when we take a look at the breakdown of EMR sentiment, It's mostly those older doctors who are upset, dissatisfied with EMR usability and function, and think in general that the EMRs are just very inefficient systems that detract from their practices. The younger doctors, the ones who are trained to use the EMRs from the beginning and in general have grown up surrounded by more tech, have had much more positive experiences with these record systems and believe that they're a very crucial part of medicine going forward. So, as more people are trained to use these EMRs and they enter the medical field, we'll most likely see a general shift about EMR sentiment as a whole. I think something really exciting that actually happened very recently is that Andy Slavitt, who's the current chief of the Center of Medicare and Medicaid Services, has basically acknowledged that the concept of meaningful use needs to change. So rather than measure the success based on the literal number of people that are using and interacting with EMRs, we need to start looking at things like actually improving the quality of care and the outcomes. So in this tweet storm that I took a screenshot of, it's clear that he's placing an emphasis on doing this by opening the EMR APIs and promoting interoperability as a whole. One of the most promising ways that the system is going about doing that is with the implementation of what's called Faster Healthcare Interoperability Resources, also pronounced FHIR. So FHIR is a standard for data exchange, and that's not only going to open up the EMR APIs, but it's also going to allow data to be exchanged in real time rather than now where it's a lot more static. And actually some of the biggest EMR providers are helping with the rollout of this, contributing to the Argonaut project, which is the name of the project that's basically helped to create this standard, set guidelines, and create the first generation API. And this is some exciting stuff. As we see here, Karl Dvorak, who's the president of Epic, talks about why they're excited to be helping with FHIR, which is basically going to let innovators work with the data to improve workflows they're already trying to work with. And several other executives from a bunch of different EMR providers have actually expressed similar sentiments to this. Now, knowing what we do now, what are some predictions for what might happen to the future EMR systems? So here's what I think. I think when the APIs finally open up and we finally achieve more interoperability between these separate systems, we might see a much more flourishing software ecosystem get built around these new data streams, similar to the third-party applications that are built on technology platforms like Salesforce or Slack. These are some of the companies that I found in the CB Insights database that are already working with EMR data in some way, shape, or form. They're either doing things like improving care coordination or providing actionable recommendations and doing quite a bit more. And once the data modes actually fall, the EHR vendors are going to have to differentiate themselves based on things like good user-centered design rather than a snapshot of what you see here. So rather than actually be judged by the amount of data they have, providers are going to choose them based on usability and the analytical tools that they provide. Finally, once the records are actually easier to access and the data starts flowing in more real time, we might actually see the takeoff of personal health records, which historically have been pretty unsuccessful ventures and have been tried by multiple of the big tech giants. But once the PHRs actually become dynamic instead of static and much easier to access, we'll probably see a lot more people actively monitoring their health. As we see from this survey that was taken by Rock Health, the interest is definitely there. All of that brings us to the next point, which is that this rise of this patient-generated out-of-hospital data is happening, and that's a big push into the dynamic health records we might see in the future. Again, a little backstory. I took this snapshot from a 2003 study about data collection and analysis, just to give a sense on how it used to be done before. And mostly it was done with techniques like self-reporting, observation, and pulling data from several disparate data sources. But luckily, today, that's changing. So thanks to the decreasing cost of sensors, we have a whole host of devices that can now provide us data in real time outside of the hospitals. And we'll dive a little bit more into each of these going forward. So first, we're going to start with wearables. Now, this has probably been one of the buzzier concepts in the list in the last few years. And when we take a look at the funding trends, it's clear that the hype grew through 2014, but since then has slowed down a bit in 2015. And despite the hype, wearables actually have a pretty low penetration rate in the population. Only 8% of people who were surveyed are actually currently wearing a fitness monitor, and only 6% of them were wearing one that was related to health. Though the projections are those percentages are going to get much bigger in the future. So what are the issues? Why does it have such a low penetration rate? Well, 24% of people say that wearables are too complicated to use. And within the products that actually have the larger market share, so companies like Fitbit, there's been a noticeably high churn with people engaging with it less and less. And importantly, there's a variation in the actual measurements that are being produced across these devices, thanks to different techniques that are being used to capture the data, and really just a lack of standards that are in place. Here are some of the things that I think are going to happen in the wearables market going forward, especially as it relates to healthcare. So rather than all-purpose wearables that attempt to measure everything that people have been calling complicated, we'll probably see a lot more condition-specific wearables to monitor things like, glucose or muscle tremors for Parkinson's. And we'll see a lot of those wearables sell through the insurance and the providers rather than the current direct-to-consumer models, which have historically been a lot harder in the healthcare space. So the first iteration of wearables basically targeted general consumer markets since they were much larger, and since they were only providing health monitoring, they didn't need to go through FDA regulation. But now those markets are becoming saturated, so we'll probably see more wearables go through the FDA process and create data that doctors will trust more and devices that they can actually train their patients to use. And finally, an underfunded space is wearables for physicians themselves, because after all, doctors are the original wearables users. These are some of the companies that are already doing condition-specific monitoring that I talked about. So an example is Y-Brain, who's monitoring brain activity for neurodegenerative disorders, or iRhythm, which uses ECGs to measure arrhythmias in real time. And like I said, wearables for doctors, which hasn't seen a ton of activity, but there are some companies that do some pretty interesting use cases, like Augmetics, which utilizes Google Glass and basically pushes patient information to the glasses, or Simplify, which uses the Apple Watch to help doctors in hands-free situations. Another huge set of data that's being created comes from the form of at-home diagnostics for patients, which is a market that continues to grow. And there are some clear benefits to diagnostic tests in the hands of patients instead of just doctors. So for one, we're seeing that there's a lot more data points being created as a whole, and that can help avoid things with mismeasurement that might happen due to only one data point, which might happen due to a fluke or circumstance. And also the measurements can actually be taken at a variety of different times instead of just at the hospital. So for example, at night or directly after meals. And these diagnostic tools will actually help primary care physicians, who are already one of the most taxed specialties in medicine right now, and it can help them take measurements that they don't have to do every single time you go visit their office. And finally, the anomalies can be caught earlier so that we can take measures to make sure that there is a healthy outcome for the patient. We're seeing financing to some private companies that do this already. So companies like AliveCore, which uses a mobile case to conduct ECGs through your phone, or something like Q, which can do a variety of hormone monitoring levels with do-it-yourself kits. The last source of new out-of-hospital data that we're going to talk about today is drug adherence, which is a huge problem and contributes somewhere between $100 and $300 billion in healthcare expenditure. And that's due to, a third of that is due to 3 chronic diseases, which is cholesterol, blood pressure, and diabetes. A big reason that adherence has been such a problem is that we really have no good ways of measuring or helping patients adhere. In the past, it was mostly done with techniques like self-reporting or questionnaires or analyzing pharmacy claims, but we had no real way of observing patients take their medicine or intervening when it was a problem. Now we're seeing we have much smarter ways of helping patients. So in a MetaSafe study, which was using mobile push notifications to remind patients about taking their drugs, there was a significant lift in adherence across the board, with some conditions like hyperlipidemia seeing a lift of more than 10%. And these are the diseases that, again, like I said, really contribute to a huge part of drug adherence expenditure. And private companies are approaching adherence in several different ways. So there are companies like AdhereTech or TowerView Health, which use smart pill boxes and pill bottles, while companies like AiCure are using artificial intelligence to remind and make sure patients are taking their meds. Now that we have all this new data being created in real time by the patient, we're getting a much better individual look at what's happening to a patient at any given part of the day. But what's happening with all that data? How are we using it efficiently? Because the worst thing that can happen is that we have this data and we basically just throw it against the wall, or in this case, a physician, and they have no idea what's relevant, what they're looking at, what the context is. So we need to do a better job of basically contextualizing this data. And that's where the Health Data 2.0 movement sort of happens, and that's making sense of this data. EMRs are slowly trying to integrate this, but because of poor infrastructure and the fact that each EMR is set up so differently, they aren't prepared to handle this wave of data creation, which provides an opportunity for some smaller, more nimble companies to do that. And an obvious change that's driving this is the use of mobile as the central point of information relay, which not only lets the average consumer monitor their health actively, but it also lets them share information with the doctors in a lot more manageable forms. And just to understand the sheer size and impact that mobile has had, there are currently more than 165,000 health-related apps in the App Store today. And what's going to be important is that we have good algorithms that can help contextualize this data, which right now is very difficult because we have all these data silos erected, and interoperability is such a huge issue, which we've talked about in the previous slides. Right now, only 2% of mobile apps can sync into a provider system. These are some of the companies that are taking advantage of that lack of EMR interoperability that I've been talking about, and they're aggregating real-time data and providing key analysis. I think what's important is also that by aggregating multiple data streams, these companies can actually do things like comorbidity analyses, which helps understand how different conditions might affect each other, and also analyze population health in real time. Now, this Data 2.0 movement is going to continue for a few reasons, but I think one of the areas that can really help out is by reducing hospital admissions. So like we talked about before, the shift to fee-for-value medicine rewards quality outcomes rather than the number of tests run, which we used to have in the system previously, but now hospitals are actually incentivized to keep patients healthy and out of the hospital. One part of pushing that initiative is actually penalizing the hospitals based on the readmissions that they have. And as you can see from the chart here, that cost is going up. Mobile health data can actually help hospitals reduce this cost. So there was a study done by Mayo Clinic which used a mobile health cardiac rehab program, which let patients monitor their health and their lifestyle in real time. And that group actually saw a 20% readmission rate compared to the 60% that happened in the control group. So there's definitely a lot of promise in that area and a lot of ways that companies can help these hospitals. And even before patients reach the hospital, we actually might be able to help them by just keeping them out in the first place. There's a burgeoning area of predictive analytics that actually help us identify at-risk patients. And in a study that was done by Optum, 55% of the patients that they had identified as high risk ended up being admitted to the hospital within 6 months. So with more data, we'll be able to intervene with these risky patients and take preventive measures to help them avoid expensive hospital visits and save the healthcare system money as a whole. And I think what's even more interesting is that the companies that are doing this predictive analytics are actually doing it basically with one arm tied behind their back. since they're focusing mostly on clinical data and claims data, which is largely static. So less than half of these companies are working with the real-time patient-generated data, which presents a huge opportunity for companies and investors. In the future, companies will probably use several of these data sources simultaneously, but we'll have to wait until those data sources can actually talk to each other. Payers are an example of a group that have so far focused on the clinical data, but they're highly interested and impacted by this new wave of hospital data that's being created. We're already seeing new insurance models come up, which basically take a very data-driven approach to their business and claim that that's their differentiator and value add. And they're doing this by doing things like integrating wearables or doing advanced population health analyses. Two of the more well-known funded private companies are Oscar and Clover Health. But the older insurance companies are not staying still about this data movement either. I took a quick snapshot from the CBI database on where Blue Cross's venture arm is investing, and a lot of the companies that they invest in actually deal directly with some of these new data streams. So companies like Change Healthcare, which monitors and analyzes claims data to help give cost-saving recommendations, or Every Move, which rewards patients based on fitness goals. So now we know how some of the new dynamic real-time data is changing old processes and affecting large corporates like insurance. But that's more focused on the payer and the provider. So what can we say about the other large corporates in healthcare, like pharmaceutical companies? Well, data is basically completely changing the way that we're doing research, conducting clinical trials, and helping drug development happen. Even the top executives at clinical research organizations understand that things need to change the way and the trials are set up and conducted to not only curb costs, but actually more importantly, save time. So as Stephen Cutler, who's the COO of ICON, which is a clinical research organization, says, a big way we can do that is by engaging patients more and having access to their real-time data. What is it about the trials now that how they're structured makes it so problematic? Well, for one, the recruitment for trials is still a very ad hoc process, and most of these patients are recruited either through partnerships with providers and physicians or targeting patients through ads, websites, etc. But also, some of the biggest cost drivers for these studies are actually rooted in the overhead that's associated with maintaining multiple physical sites that participants actually need to travel to, which in and of itself presents issues with what kind of people can participate in those studies. And like we talked about before, adherence and retention is a huge issue for these studies, but we already talked about some of the mobile solutions that are addressing those issues. So all in all, these kind of problems lead to very expensive studies, but also very long timelines. Drugs can end up going through clinical trial processes for 15 years in some cases. So companies want to get their drugs and their products out as quickly as possible, so any solutions that save them time will be helpful to them. One of the biggest time savers would be the ability to recruit patients in a faster and more targeted manner. 9 out of 10 studies have significantly extended their timelines just to find enough people to participate in the study, and 48% of studies under-enroll as a whole. And the big issue is that because a large majority of patients don't even know that the trials exist that are relevant to them, and that's a huge disconnect because a lot of them actually want to enroll in trials that might be relevant. A survey done by Zogby Analytics found that 53% of patients were not aware of these trials, and that was the #1 reason for them not enrolling as a whole. Several companies are now working on mining clinical data to make patients and providers aware of some of the relevant clinical trials that might be going on. A huge advancement in this field comes in the form of Apple's Research Kit, which allows developers to utilize the mobile and smartwatch technology to become better tools for research. And the company is already working with several different organizations to conduct studies on conditions like asthma, autism, Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease, and they're doing that by using some of the hardware that's already in these phones, like the accelerometer or the camera. So the research kit and in general the mobile clinical trial solutions we've been talking about are going to be huge for reducing the costs associated with maintaining multiple sites for these research studies. So this chart shows, and it might be a little bit hard to see, but they actually contribute to a third of the costs that are required for these studies. So using these mobile solutions, we can actually reduce the number of physical sites necessary, which reduce costs, but also make sure that patients aren't limited by their physical proximity to the site or their physical ability to get to the site. And the number and the types of patients you get for these studies are critical. So I took a snapshot of some previous studies that were done that were studying relatively similar things. So in this case, lifestyle and how it relates to cardiovascular disease. And as you can see here, there were a little bit more than 3,200 participants. In this study, we saw closer to 17,000 participants, but they were all Canadian. And here in an intervention study, it was a little bit more than 500 patients, and the intervention was an automated phone call or bringing a physical tracker to your physician appointments. Now, keep in mind, these are all studies that were done relatively recently, so between 2005 and 2010. But now, in the era of the research kit and mobile health solutions, we can actually do a lifestyle cardiovascular study on more than 40,000 people who are geography agnostic, and it's pushing information to their phones, which have a very high penetration and engagement rate. So really, this is just an entirely new era of doing clinical research, thanks to mobile solutions and out-of-hospital data. The end goal should be using data in every part of the process to make this a much more efficient, make this much more efficient as a whole. So we'd be using clinical data to help patients find trials that are relevant to them. Those trials would be conducted as remotely as possible with a central coordinating center, and would capture data during all times during the day, regardless of geography, and takes data from a wide variety of sources simultaneously. And these are some of the companies that are helping to facilitate some of the changes that I've been talking about. So whether that's helping patients navigate the eligibility criteria for these studies, or companies like Elemental Machines, which very recently raised from the Founders Fund, which can use this data from the lab to help improve reproducibility and identify problems. I think what's interesting to note is that when we plot out the investments that pharmaceutical companies have made in private markets using our business social graph tool, most big pharma companies, with the exception of Roche and Merck, have actually not invested in digital health companies, despite the fact that a lot of the data that's being created is directly applicable to them and the processes for the clinical trials we're talking about. Pharma has definitely been on the slower side to take advantage of these trends in digital health, and they focus their private market investments much more into some smaller pharmaceutical companies rather than invest in a change in process itself. So we've been talking about the integration of some of the current technology as it enters the healthcare space, but we've been focusing a lot more on the providers and the payers. But the next frontier of patient data is going to be based on our genetic data and how it's associated with one of the buzziest words in healthcare, which is precision medicine. Gene sequencing, the price of gene sequencing has dropped very drastically, even faster than Moore's Law, from the hundreds of millions it used to cost years ago to now the $1,000 less that it costs today. And that drop in cost is largely associated to a grant scheme that was concocted by the government to bring all the leading scientists in the field together to improve sequencing techniques. And the decline in sequencing costs has made it much more regularly available to the average person. So we're seeing an explosion of genetic data being created as more and more people get their genes sequenced. And this is only going to accelerate in the future. So we're seeing, some predictions saying by 2024 we'll see 34 million people with their entire genome sequenced. And what can we do with this genetic data? Well, some applications that we're seeing now include things like understanding the likelihood to develop conditions in the future and taking active measures to prevent that. So for example, we're slowly understanding that certain gene mutations are linked to certain cancers. So people with that mutation can now more actively monitor themselves or they can get preventive surgeries. We can also now understand if couples are carriers for hereditary diseases, which can help them with family planning. And we're also seeing the rise of a field called pharmacogenomics, which helps us understand how patients react to drugs, and that way we can, again, going back to personalized medicine, we can give a more specific dosage and monitor the efficacy or the side effects in those patients. And this is an area that pharmaceutical companies have really taken a big interest in and have partnered with some of the top genetic sequencing companies to really understand what to do with this trove of genetic data. One thing I want to highlight that I think is really important here is that we're still in the infancy of this field, and we don't have a great understanding of what this genetic data means. So here I took snapshots of 2 different studies which analyzed the same thing, which was using genotype guidance to understand the effect of warfarin therapy. And what's interesting is that both studies came to the opposite conclusion. So here we're seeing that the hypothesis that using the genotype guiding dosing actually is not superior, and here we're seeing that it is superior. So this just goes to show you that even though we're generating this data, we still don't quite understand a lot about it. And what should be the next steps so that we can better utilize this data? Well, we need larger longitudinal studies to really assess the validity of these gene markers, and we need to do it with a more diverse population, since right now it's limited to people that can afford it, have it available to them, and are active about getting their DNA sequenced. This will change as we lower the cost of gene sequencing, but as we do that, a lot more of this data is going to be created, so we're going to need better ways of analyzing all this genetic information, which will be done once the ecosystem of software and services starts getting built around it. And we're seeing that that's already happening. So this graphic is a little bit old, but just gives a sense on how more money is now going into the services and software part rather than the actual sequencing itself, which is really just a sign of a maturing industry. I did a keyword search using genetics in the CBI database, and I found a bunch of different companies that were working in the space, with 23andMe probably being the most well-known. It recently passed FDA regulation and offers a $200 home testing kit, but now we're seeing funding into companies like Spiral Genetics, which are applying big data techniques to help make sense of this new data. And that kind of data analysis is very tough and requires a lot of processing power, sensors, and a whole host of other tech-related components. And that's why tech giants see a huge opportunity in the healthcare space. So we're going to just take a little bit of time to talk about a few case studies on some of the big tech companies and what they're doing in healthcare. I did a keyword search, so we're going to start with IBM, which is Watson's supercomputer. So IBM has been working on Watson for a while now, and now they're moving into the commercial product. And the company has highlighted quite a few use cases for healthcare. So not only can the computer analyze millions of medical journals and other disparate data sources, but it can actually use that ability to synthesize information and act as a Siri for doctors, help match clinical trials, but also help drug development companies in the development phase. To bolster their capabilities, they've acquired at least 3 companies, including a $1 billion acquisition of Merge Healthcare for their clinical images. They've also acquired Exploris and Phytel for their data cleansing and population health analysis. And Watson's powerful analytical capabilities are already being used by a variety of large players, including CVS, which is using predictive analytics to identify risky patients, large drug companies like Sanofi, so they can better understand the effects of their chemical compounds, and Johnson & Johnson to power a virtual AI coaching and rehab program. They're also powering the genetic analysis for the New York Genome Center. And it's not just big companies, they're also partnering and powering some of the smaller private companies involved in a lot of different types of data, from genetic to EMR to personal health records. The next case we're going to take a look at is the chipmaker Qualcomm, who has an opportunity by powering a lot of these devices that are outside of the hospital. So if we look at their private market activity, which includes both investments and acquisitions, it's clear that there was a surge of interest for them moving into 2014, and still exists, though it's tapered off a bit in 2015. Qualcomm is powering what they call the IoMT movement, which is the Internet of Medical Technology. And they have a few different product offerings, such as a platform to capture all connected devices that are transmitting biometric data, and also a SaaS offering to facilitate communication and record sharing among relevant parties. And on top of all that, Qualcomm Life is actually powering more than 109 different organizations with its different offerings and its chip technology. And I'd be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about Alphabet and Google as a player in this area. So I won't have time to touch on everything they're doing, but between the research divisions, investment arm, and the parent company itself, it's very active in the healthcare data arena in multiple different ways. I took a few select partnerships that I thought were interesting. So on the one hand, we're seeing Google powering the movement in wearables by partnering with companies like Dexcom and Novartis to create new types of glucose monitoring wearables. But we're also seeing that the company is applying its powerful analytics to help people make sense of their data. So that's what they're doing with Sanofi. They're also doing it with the Mayo Clinic, where they're helping to provide relevant medical information and answers to some commonly searched symptoms and diseases. And lastly, it's clear that Google is interested in the personal health record space. So like we talked about, that space has been typically hard in the past, and the Google Health Initiative actually tried to do this many years ago, but ended up failing. But now Google has revealed the Google Fit platform, which aggregates data across different Android platforms to provide users a look into their lifestyles. And if Google themselves aren't doing it, they're investing in companies that are. A significant part of their portfolio includes health data companies, which are working in spaces like oncology or genetics, predictive analytics, and even remote clinical labs. So as we're coming to the end of this webinar, I thought a good way to close this off would be to ask some more open-ended questions. So the first, and the one that probably popped into most of your heads, was who's going to own this data? If it's generated by the patient, should they own it? But since the data is touched by so many different organizations, like your EMR system, your provider, your insurance, the question really has to be asked, who's going to own this data, and are patients going to have to consent every time it's sent? And the reason is because that patient data is extremely valuable since it's so personal. Even before we know who's owning the data, how do we make sure that the data is secure in the first place? Data breaches in other industries are much less costly compared to data breaches that happen in the healthcare space. And finally, does de-identifying the patient data even help anymore? As we get more granular data, specifically genetic data, we can actually piece together what you look like and the characteristics about you. So we can do that even without patient identifiers. But now, thanks to strict HIPAA regulations, data that could be incredibly helpful if it were free-flowing and in the right hands is instead tied up behind privacy. So at a certain point, we have to ask, are the costs of slowing information down worth the benefits of keeping it private? And so that's the end of the webinar today. I know I went through a lot rather quickly. So if you have any other questions about things I didn't touch on, or want to talk about anything specific, please feel free to reach out to me either on Twitter, or you can email me, nkrishnan@cvinsights.com, and I'll do my best to answer those questions. We have a little bit of time now to actually take a few questions, so I'm going to take a look through some of the questions that you have asked, and I'll try to answer as many as I can. So one question I'm getting asked is, do you see quantifiable called Proteus, which helps detect EMR entry. But again, you can find more private companies like that in the CB Insights database itself. But I do know that in part of the Cybersecurity Act of 2015, which was passed very recently, the Department of Health and Human Services was tasked with basically creating a task force to understand what security safeguards are working in other industries, and then report back about how secure our current health system is and ways that it can be improved. Does blockchain play into digital health? I think this is a really interesting question. I was just reading about this the other day. One of the things that's very interesting about blockchain is it can actually help with a very crucial issue that's happening in healthcare right now, which is creating patient identifier numbers to basically help coordinate this data as it comes from a lot of disparate places without any sort of unique identifier. But the blockchain can actually help with that by using distributed ledgers and basically identified transactions to monitor the movement of healthcare data as it moves sort of through the system. How can we know that the data being created by these devices is accurate? So I talked a little bit about this before, but I think when it comes to medical grade technology, the FDA process is a real necessity to make sure that the data capture is accurate, but also that the data that's being collected is actually useful in providing better care and improved outcomes. Some of the wearables out in the market today, which haven't gone through FDA regulation, can sometimes provide a wide range of readings. So there have been some reports that certain wearables like to flatter their users and basically give them an edge towards more beneficial readings. But there are also some wearables that are now being analyzed in peer-reviewed journals like JAMA and Nature to determine their accuracy. So you can take a look to see if the devices you're talking about are in any of these journals. What about cost transparency data, and how is that going to affect the system and consumer choices? I think this is a good question, and it's one that I really didn't have time to get to in this session because it's sort of a topic in itself that could have its own webinar. But cost transparency is definitely one of the biggest drivers in the shift from fee-for-service to fee-for-value. And it gives a lot more responsibility to the patient, who can now do things like a price comparison from insurance or understand what procedures cost what where. I do think that cost transparency has a few roadblocks and issues like the fact that you're not going to be doing price shopping when you're in an emergency situation, and the fact that there still aren't great ways to assess quality of life post certain procedures. So I think this is a good question, and I think that cost transparency has generally good intentions for the healthcare system, but it definitely has a lot of important implications, and not all of them are positive. Why do you think pharma has been slow to bet on digital health? I think one is because pharmaceutical companies are extremely large, and large organizations as a whole are generally much slower to change processes that are current, and they investing in such a massive overhaul is generally a very time-consuming, capital-intensive process for them. And pharma companies are not doing badly, as I'm sure. Pharma companies, a lot of the bigger ones are still very profitable. So in terms of digital health adoption, I'm sure it will happen in the future as they need to increase efficiency, and once they see the viability of reducing things like FDA clinical trial time. So I think it'll happen. I just think they've been slow because as a whole, they're much larger companies. Okay, so it looks like we're running out of time right now, but I will take a look at as many of these questions as possible, and I'll try to email you or write a blog post about questions that I see that are commonly asked. And again, just want to make sure you guys know that a lot of the data that was used in this presentation come from the CB Insights database, where you can find interesting companies in the digital health space, and some of the trends that are happening as a whole. Thank you guys for attending today, and I hope this webinar was informational.
Muted.